My name is Eli Mercer, and I was 33 the day my own father laughed at me in a lawyer's office. We were there for the reading of my grandfather's will. The lawyer cleared his throat, looked at me, and said I had inherited the house on Sycamore Road and $10. The room exploded. My dad leaned back, grinning, and said it loud enough for everyone. "You wasted your time on a broke old man. Now you get a pile of junk." I didn't argue. I smiled, picked up the worn bill they slid across the table, and walked out. What none of them understood was that the bill had a number on it. My grandfather had spent my whole childhood teaching me how to read numbers like that. 48 hours later, I knew exactly what they'd done. Welcome back to Calm Drama Stories, where the people who get underestimated keep their voices low and let the truth do the shouting. If you've ever been handed the smallest seat at the table, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. The office belonged to Howard Pruitt, who had handled Mercer family business for 30 years. He had a way of reading legal documents like he was apologizing for them. My Uncle Curtis sat near the window in a pressed gray suit, calm as a man who already knew the ending. His wife, Brenda, kept checking her phone. My two cousins took the good chairs. My father, Raymond, took the head of the table like it was his by right. I sat by the door. Pruitt started with the store. Curtis would keep operational control of Mercer Hardware and Supply. Raymond would receive the cash accounts. The cousins each got a small sum. Then Pruitt reached my name, and his voice slowed. "To my granddaughter, Eli, I leave the house on Sycamore Road and $10. For a breath, nobody spoke. Then Brenda laughed first, a short bark, and the rest followed. Curtis didn't laugh. He watched me. That was the part I would remember later. Pruitt slid an envelope across the table, and inside was a single $10 bill, soft as cloth, the corners rounded from handling. My father wiped his eyes like the whole thing was the best joke he'd heard in years. $10 and a tear down, he said. He really did love you, kid. I held the bill and felt how thin it was, how deliberately old. My grandfather kept new bills for groceries and old ones for lessons. He never handed me a worn one by accident. So I asked myself the only question that mattered in that room full of laughter. Why would a man who labeled every screw in his workshop leave me exactly this, and nothing else? I put the envelope in my coat, said thank you to Pruitt, and stood up. Nobody noticed I wasn't upset. People in town knew me as the quiet one at the library. I ran the branch on 3rd Street, reshelved returns, helped retirees with their tax forms, and ate lunch at my desk. I liked order. I liked a system that told the truth when you followed it all the way down. For the last 5 years of Walter's life, I was also the one who showed up. I drove him to his cardiologist on the 2nd Tuesday of every month. I filled his pillbox on Sundays. I sat with him while the rest of the family was always, somehow, busy. I never minded. That was my weakness, if you want to call it that. I carried things nobody asked me to carry, because putting them down felt like quitting. My grandfather understood that about me better than anyone. When I was 8, he used to hide a quarter somewhere in the house and leave me a string of numbers on a notepad. "Count carefully," he'd say, tapping the page. The numbers were never random. They were a route, a page in a book, a tile from the corner, a drawer from the left. It took me a summer to learn his patterns. After that, I could read him like a map. The family thought it was a silly game an old man played with a lonely kid. To me, it was the first real conversation I ever had with someone who believed I was clever. So when my father called my inheritance a pile of junk, I didn't feel small. I felt the worn edges of that $10 bill in my pocket, and I thought about a man who never once gave me a number that didn't lead somewhere. The laughter in that office made sense once you knew what my family thought Walter was. He opened Mercer Hardware in 1968 with a loan and a handshake. For decades, it was the place where every contractor in the county bought their nails and every kid bought their first pocket knife. Then my father and uncle grew up, came into the business, and decided the old man was holding it back. They modernized. They added a second register, a credit line, a back office with a computer Walter never touched. Slowly they moved him to the front counter, then to a stool by the door, then home. By the time I was in college, the family story was settled. Walter had been a decent man and a poor businessman. He'd let the store slide, never saved, never invested, and would die with nothing. Raymond repeated it so often it became gospel. "Dad means well," he'd say, but he couldn't run a lemonade stand. I believed it too, for a while. Why wouldn't I? The man drove a 15-year-old truck and clipped coupons. But there was one thing that never fit. Walter was the most exact person I ever met. He balanced his checkbook to the penny. He kept receipts in chronological order going back to the Nixon administration. A man like that doesn't lose track of money by accident. Once, near the end, he held my hand on the porch and said something I filed away without understanding. "The store was never the point, Eli." I thought he was being sentimental. Now I had a house full of his careful order and a worn bill in my pocket, and I started to wonder what the point actually was. The store was their crown. It turned out it was also their alibi. I drove out to the Sycamore house 2 days after the funeral. It sat at the edge of town, 15 minutes from my apartment, on a road that turned to gravel near the end. From the outside, my father wasn't wrong. The porch sagged on one corner. The gutters had given up. A shutter hung crooked like a loose tooth. Anyone glancing from the road would see a tear down and keep driving. I let myself in with the key Pruitt had given me, and the smell hit me first: cedar and machine oil, the exact smell of my grandfather's hands. For a second I was 8 years old again, standing in his workshop while he sharpened a chisel. Then I looked around and the contradiction settled in. The house was falling apart on the outside and perfectly ordered on the inside. Every book on the shelf was alphabetized. The kitchen drawers were labeled in his small block printing. The closet held shirts arranged by color, then by age. This was not the home of a man who had stopped caring. This was the home of a man who cared about everything and wanted it to look like he didn't. I walked the room slowly, the way I walk the stacks at closing, checking that everything is where it should be. Nothing was dusty. Nothing was random. On the wall by the back door hung a calendar from the hardware store. 2 years old, every doctor's appointment marked in his hand, including the ones I had driven him to. He had kept a record of me showing up. I stood there longer than I meant to. A tear down, my father called it. But you don't label every drawer in a house you've given up on. You label them because you expect someone to come looking. That night, I sat at the kitchen table and took out the bill. I smoothed it flat under the lamp and looked at the serial number, the way I hadn't let myself in the lawyer's office. The string of letters and digits ran along the bottom corner, and the moment I read it, something old woke up in me. The grouping was wrong for a random bill. Walter's number games always started the same way: a pair of letters that meant a category, then digits that meant a location. I read it again. The first letters matched a code we used for the workshop. The digits split cleanly into 2 short runs, the way a drawer number and a row number would. My hands went cold, not from fear, but from recognition. He hadn't left me $10. He'd left me an instruction. I found a pencil and copied the number onto the back of a library receipt, then broke it into pieces the way he taught me. Letters first, then the long run, then the short one. It pointed toward the workshop, and inside the workshop, toward something counted from a corner. I didn't go out there that night. I sat with it instead, turning the bill over in my fingers, hearing his voice as clearly as if he were across the table. "Count carefully." For most of my life, I'd thought that was just how he said be patient. Now I understood it was a literal set of directions, waiting 25 years for the only person who'd bothered to learn the language. The room they'd laughed in flashed back to me. My father's grin, Brenda's bark, Curtis watching. They thought the joke was that I got nothing. The joke was that I was the only one he trusted with everything. My father called the next morning before I'd finished my coffee. He skipped hello. "I've been thinking about that house," he said, friendly in the way that always means a trap. "It's a liability. Bad wiring, mold, the whole thing. You hold on to it, you'll be paying taxes on a teardown for years." I said I hadn't decided anything yet. Well, don't overthink it, he said. I know a developer. Cash offer, quick close, takes the headache off your hands. You sign, you walk away clean. There it was. The speed. My father had never once moved fast to help me with anything. Now he wanted papers signed before the estate had even cleared probate. I'm not a dramatic person, but I am a careful one, and careful people notice when someone is suddenly in a hurry. So I did what I always do when something doesn't add up. I asked a question. Why's he in such a rush for a place that's falling down? There was a small pause, the kind you can hear. He flips lots, my dad said. Don't make it weird, Eli. I told him I'd think about it, hung up, and did 3 things. I photographed every room in the house. I called Pruitt's office to confirm the probate timeline and learned nothing could close for weeks. And I wrote down the date and time of my father's call in the notebook I keep for everything. I wasn't being paranoid. I was being a librarian. When a man who never helped you starts pushing you to sign away the one thing he laughed at, you don't sign. You start a record. Brenda texted an hour later, all hearts and concern, asking if I needed help clearing out Grandpa's mess. I didn't answer. The mess, I was starting to think, was the whole point. The workshop stood behind the house, a low building that smelled even more strongly of cedar and oil. Walter had built it himself. Inside, one whole wall was a grid of small wooden drawers, each one numbered in his block print, the way a card catalog used to be before everything went digital. I stood in front of it and read my pencil notes again. The letters from the serial number named this wall. The long run gave me a drawer. The short run gave me a position inside it. I counted carefully, the way he'd drilled into me, and pulled the drawer open. Inside, under a tray of brass fittings, was a notebook with a cracked green spine. It wasn't an inventory book. The cover was worn soft at the corner where a thumb would rest. I lifted it out, and a folded slip of paper fell from between the pages. His handwriting, unmistakable. The line he'd said to me 100 times. Cheap things hide the truth. Count carefully. I read it twice, then sat down on his work stool with the green ledger in my lap. The first pages looked like ordinary bookkeeping. Dates, amounts, short notes. But the longer I looked, the less ordinary it became. These weren't store sales. The entries tracked money moving out of accounts, not in. Each line had a date, a figure, and a pair of initials. Some of the initials were CM. Some were RM. My uncle. My father. I didn't understand the whole picture yet, but I understood enough to feel the floor shift. My grandfather hadn't kept a hardware ledger in a hidden drawer behind a code only I could read. He'd kept something else, and he'd built a quarter-century-long trail of breadcrumbs so that one day, the careful granddaughter would follow it out here and open this exact drawer. This wasn't junk. This was a record of something. I took the green ledger home and spread it across my kitchen table under good light, the way I'd lay out a damaged book before repair. I'm trained to read documents that don't want to be read. Faded due date cards, water-stained donations, marginalia in 3 languages. A handmade ledger was nothing I couldn't handle. I started by separating what I knew from what I didn't. The columns were consistent. Date, amount, a code letter, and those initials. The dates ran across 9 years, ending about a year before Walter got too sick to write. The amounts were never round. That was the first thing that bothered me. Real expenses are often round. A flat fee, an even payment. These were jagged, specific. The kind of numbers you get when you're skimming a percentage off something larger and trying not to leave a clean trail. I pulled out my own notes from helping Walter with his banking those last years and laid them beside the ledger. The store's official numbers, the ones the family bragged about, told a story of a healthy business. Walter's private ledger told a different one. Money was leaving accounts that the official books never mentioned. 2 sets of figures for the same business, and only one of them matched reality. I sat back. My grandfather, the man they called a poor businessman, had been quietly keeping a parallel record of his own company's money for nearly a decade. He wasn't bad with numbers. He was better than all of them. He just stopped telling anyone, because at some point he realized the people stealing were the people at his own dinner table. The question that kept me up wasn't whether something was wrong. It was how long my grandfather had known, and why he waited to act until he was already gone. For the next week, I worked the ledger like a research project. This is the part nobody in my family would have believed I was capable of, which is exactly why Walter chose me. They saw a woman who stamped books. I saw a problem with a findable answer. I cross-referenced the dates in the green ledger against everything I could legally pull: county business filings, public liens, the hardware store's vendor list, which I knew by heart from years of hearing Walter recite it. Where the official store records showed a payment to a supplier, the green ledger sometimes showed a second, smaller withdrawal a few days later, marked with initials. The pattern was patient and ugly. For nearly every legitimate transaction, a sliver had been peeled off and routed somewhere else. Alone, any single line could be explained away. A petty cash error, a duplicate entry. But the pattern held across 9 years, in two handwritings that weren't Walter's, and patterns don't lie the way people do. I started building a timeline on index cards, one card per suspicious entry, pinned to my living room wall like a caseboard. By Friday, the wall was full, and the shape of it was unmistakable. This wasn't a struggling old man losing money. This was a steady, deliberate drain, running for years, hidden inside a business everyone praised. And the man who'd noticed first, who'd documented all of it in code, had handed the whole thing to the one person nobody would suspect of being dangerous. I looked at that wall of cards and felt something I wasn't proud of. Not grief, not even anger yet. Something colder and steadier. I felt like a librarian who has finally found the missing volume and knows exactly which shelf it was stolen from. Curtis came to the Sycamore house on a Sunday, uninvited. I heard his sedan on the gravel and met him on the porch before he could come in. He smiled the way he smiled at the will reading, calm and a little sorry for me. "Just checking on you," he said. "Big job, clearing all this out. You shouldn't have to do it alone." His eyes weren't on me. They moved past my shoulder, into the house, scanning. Living room, hallway, the door to the back that led toward the workshop. "I've got it handled," I said. He nodded slowly. "You know, your dad's right about the developer. This place is full of old junk. Easy to get attached to things that don't matter." He let that sit. "Wouldn't want you wasting weeks digging through an old man's clutter and finding nothing but heartache." I kept my face the way I keep it at the desk when someone's lying about their late fees. Pleasant. Unreadable. "I appreciate the concern," I said. He looked at me a moment longer than was friendly, then patted the porch rail like he was saying goodbye to the house instead of me. "Let me know if you change your mind." I watched his car until the dust settled on the gravel. Here's what I understood, standing on that sagging porch. My uncle had not driven 15 minutes on a Sunday to comfort his grieving niece. He'd come to find out what I'd found. The word junk was doing a lot of work in this family lately, always from the same two mouths, always aimed at the same house. People don't keep telling you something is worthless, unless they're afraid of what it's worth. I keep getting asked why I didn't just sell the house and walk away with the cash, because my grandfather didn't hide a record in a place anyone lazy would look. He hid it where only someone who cared enough to count would find it. If you've ever been the one who showed up when no one else did, subscribe. This story is for you. I went back to the drawers after Curtis left, because now I was certain there was more. I read more serial number logic into the ledger's first page, where Walter had written a single faint string in pencil along the margin. It pointed to a different drawer, low on the wall, near the floor. I counted carefully and opened it. Beneath a tray of drill bits was a flat metal tin, and inside the tin, wrapped in cloth, was a card I had never seen in my life. It was a federal identification, decades old, with a younger Walter's unsmiling face. The agency name meant something even to a person who only knew it from history books. Underneath, in a separate envelope, were letters of commendation, the kind written in careful government language that says a great deal by saying almost nothing. For most of his working life, My grandfather had not been a traveling auditor for a supply company, which is what the family always said he did before the store. He had spent those years quietly, for the government, doing the kind of work where you learn to document everything and trust no one's account but your own. I sat on the workshop floor with the tin in my lap, and the whole man rearranged in my head. The labeled drawers, the penny exact checkbook, the number games, the parallel ledger kept in code. It wasn't the eccentricity of a lonely old man, it was training. He had built a life on the principle that the truth survives only if someone writes it down where it can't be erased, and when he saw his own sons quietly looting the thing he'd built, he didn't confront them or shout. He did the only thing he knew how to do. He opened a clean page, picked up a pencil, and started keeping the record. There was one name that kept appearing in the margins of the ledger, H. Coyle, beside a few entries near the end, always with a small star. I knew the name. Henry Coyle had managed the old savings bank on Main Street before it changed hands, and he and Walter had been friends since before I was born. He was in his late 70s now, living above what used to be his branch. I brought him coffee and sat in his cluttered living room, and when I mentioned the green ledger, his face changed. He set his cup down carefully. "I wondered if you'd come," he said. "Walter told me one of you might." He was very specific that it would be the one who asked the right question, not the one who needed the money most. I asked what the right question was. Henry smiled, sad and tired. "You just asked it by bringing that book here." He told me slowly that Walter had known for years what his sons were doing, that he'd come to Henry not to stop it in a hurry, but to make sure that when the time came, the evidence would be clean, traceable, and impossible to dismiss as an old man's confusion. He'd even chosen the bill himself, Henry told me, worked through a strap of tens until he found a serial number whose letters and digits lined up with the counting games he'd drilled into me since I was a girl, then left it sealed with the lawyer under written instructions that it reach me by hand, and no one else. "He didn't want revenge," Henry said. He kept saying that word back to me. He said he wanted a record. He said the loud ones always win the argument, but the careful ones win the case. Henry looked at me over his glasses. "He left you something at the bank, Eli. He left it where only the number on that bill could reach it. I'm not allowed to just hand it over. But if you bring me the right number, I'm allowed to take you to it." I felt the worn bill in my pocket like it had gained weight. "Count carefully," I said. Henry nodded. "He told me you'd say that." Before the bank, there was one more drawer. Henry's words sent me back to the workshop with new eyes, and I found it where Walter would have wanted the most patient person to look last, behind the green ledger's drawer, in a false back I'd missed because I'd stopped counting one position too soon. Inside was a sealed envelope with my name on it in his block print, and beneath it, a thin stack of bank statements held together with a paper clip gone orange with age. I opened the statements first, because I needed my hands to do something while my chest caught up. They were Walter's personal accounts, the ones I'd helped him read in his last years when his eyes failed. And there, in black and white, were withdrawals I had never authorized and he had never made, transfers out, signed with a signature that was almost his but not quite, dated in the months when he could barely hold a pen. My uncle and my father hadn't only skimmed the business. Near the end, when Walter was weakest, they had reached into his own accounts and taken from the man directly, forging the hand of someone too sick to stop them. I had to put the papers down and breathe. Then I opened the letter. It was short. The way he was short. Every word load-bearing. He wrote that he was sorry to leave me a fight instead of a gift. He wrote that he'd watched me show up every Sunday and knew I was the only one in the family who understood that love is mostly just paying attention. He wrote that the $10 bill was the key to a drawer at Henry's old bank, that the number told me which one, and that everything I needed to finish what he'd started was waiting inside. And at the bottom, underlined once, he wrote the thing I would carry into every room after that. "Cheap things hide the truth. Count carefully. You always could." I sat in his workshop, in the smell of cedar and oil, and I stopped being a granddaughter sorting through junk. I became the keeper of the record. I read the letter again that night, and then a third time, until I could hear it instead of see it. People assume a moment like that fills you with rage, and I waited for the rage, because it would have been simpler. It didn't come the way I expected. What came instead was a strange, steadying clarity. My grandfather had handed me his whole life's lesson folded into a single instruction. He could have torched the family from his deathbed. He could have called a lawyer and made a scene and let the town watch his sons burn while he was still alive to enjoy it. He didn't, and I finally understood why. A scene fades. A confrontation becomes one person's word against another's. He had lived a life where loud accusations died in the noise and only documents survived. So he chose the slow, quiet, unkillable thing. He chose to be right on paper, in a way no smirk or denial could ever erase. And he chose me to carry it. Not because the family owed me anything, and not because I needed the money. He chose me because I was the one who'd learned to count carefully when it was just a game between an old man and a lonely kid. I looked at my wall of index cards, at the green ledger, at the forged statements, at the letter. I thought about my father's grin in that office, and Brenda's bark of a laugh, and Curtis watching me with those careful eyes. I wasn't going to scream at them. I wasn't going to record them or trap them or stoop to their volume. I was going to do exactly what Walter taught me. I was going to gather every page, put it in the hands of people whose job is the truth, and let the record speak in a room where nobody could laugh it away. This wasn't revenge. It was an accounting. Henry met me at the bank on a Tuesday morning for an appointment he'd helped me set up. It was never as simple as walking in with a number. Walter had registered the box years earlier and named me, in writing, as the person entitled to it after his death. The estate paperwork from the will reading and my own ID were what actually persuaded them to open it. The serial number was never the key. It was the map. Once the manager confirmed who I was, the bill told me which box among hundreds was his, the letters naming the row, the long run naming the drawer, the short run matching a note Walter had left on file. It matched. The drawer slid out long and heavy. Inside was the rest of it, and the rest of it was everything. Years of bank statements, organized by account. A second set of the store's books, the real one, kept alongside the fake one so the difference could be read at a glance. Photocopies of checks with the forged signatures laid beside genuine ones for comparison, and a typed index, in Walter's exact language, explaining what each document proved and how it connected to the next. He hadn't left me a pile of clues. He'd left me a finished case, assembled by a man who'd spent his career learning how evidence has to be built to survive contact with people who lie for a living. I stood there with my hand flat on the stack and felt the last piece click. The serial number on a $10 bill, the joke of the will reading, the thing they laughed at, had led, exactly as he planned, to a drawer that held the proof of everything they'd taken. Henry watched me quietly. "He used to say you'd know what to do with it," he said. I did know. I wasn't going to confront anyone. I was going to take this to the only people who could turn a record into a reckoning. "I need a forensic accountant," I said, "and then I need a prosecutor." Henry nodded. "He said you'd say that too." My father found out I'd been to the bank, the way he found out everything, through Brenda and a phone tree of relatives. He came at me the only way he knew, in public and loud. He showed up at the library on a Wednesday afternoon, during story hour, with a room full of parents and toddlers as his audience. He didn't shout, not at first. He leaned on my desk and said, just loud enough to carry, that he was worried about me. That grief made people do strange things. That I'd been harassing the family and manipulating a dying man for months. A mother near the picture books looked up. "It's sad," he said, shaking his head for the crowd. "She got the old man to change things at the end, when he wasn't himself. We're trying to be gentle about it. It was a clean piece of work, I'll give him that." In one move he made himself the patient one and me, the schemer. The story would be all over town by dinner. Walter's quiet granddaughter, exposed as a greedy opportunist who'd preyed on a confused old man. I kept my voice level. You should go, Dad. There are kids here. He smiled like he'd won, straightened up, and left me standing in front of my co-workers and patrons with my face hot. For one ugly minute, I wanted to chase him into the parking lot and scream the truth at his back. I didn't. I went into the workroom, closed the door, and wrote down the date, the time, the words he used, and the names of 3 witnesses. He'd chosen his weapon. He would shame me in public, loudly, in front of as many people as possible. I'd already chosen mine. I would tell the truth quietly, on paper, in front of the only audience that counted. That night, I made copies of everything. Then I made copies of the copies, and I put one set in a fireproof bag, one in a deposit box of my own, and one in the trunk of my car. Old habits from a grandfather who taught me that the truth only survives if it exists in more than one place. I did not buy a recorder. I did not try to bait my father or uncle into saying something on a call I could play back later. I'd watched enough people lose by stooping to the other side's game. My family's weapon was noise. Public shame, fast talk, the confident lie repeated until it sounded like history. If I answered noise with noise, it would come down to whose voice carried further, and theirs always had. So I refused the fight they wanted and chose the one they couldn't win. I would not be louder. I would be documented. The next morning, I called the office of a forensic accountant 2 towns over, someone I'd found through the County Bar Association's referral list. I wanted a professional with no ties to anyone named Mercer. Her name was Paula Reyes, and she'd spent 15 years reconstructing financial crimes for exactly these situations. I told her I had 9 years of parallel ledgers, forged signatures, and bank statements, assembled by the victim before his death. There was a pause on the line, the good kind, the kind a professional makes when an ordinary-sounding call turns serious. Bring all of it, she said. Originals and copies. Don't reorganize anything. I want to see it the way he left it. I hung up and felt the shape of the path ahead. It was slow. It was unglamorous. It was exactly what Walter would have done. Paula Reyes spread Walter's record across a conference table and went silent for a long time. I watched her read the way I read, finger tracking down a column, eyes flicking between 2 pages, a small notebook filling with her own marks. After an hour, she looked up. Your grandfather, she said slowly, did about 80% of my job for me before he died. She walked me through what the documents showed. The store's official books reported steady, healthy revenue, but the bank statements told a quieter story. Money leaving through vendor payments that were inflated, then partially routed back out to accounts that didn't belong to the business. Over 9 years, the skimmed amounts added up to a figure that made my stomach drop, well into 6 figures. Then there were the personal withdrawals from Walter's own accounts in his final 2 years, signed with a hand that didn't match his earlier signatures. This last part is different, Paula said, tapping the forged checks. Taking from a business you help run is one thing. Taking directly from an elderly man's personal accounts using a forged signature while he's incapacitated, that's its own category. She was careful with her language, the way honest experts are. She didn't say anyone would go to prison. She said the documentation was strong, that it quantified the loss clearly, and that under Ohio law this pattern could support both civil recovery by the estate and a referral for criminal review. Could, she repeated, looking at me to make sure I heard it. I'm an accountant, not a prosecutor, but I've testified in a lot of these, and I can tell you, most cases don't arrive on my desk this organized. He didn't leave you a mess, Ms. Mercer. He left you a brief. I asked what came next. She capped her pen. Now we make it official. The lawyer Paula referred me to was an estate attorney named Grace Whitfield, and the first thing she did was slow me down. I came in ready to bury my family, and she made me sit with the rules. Not everything Walter documented could be acted on, she explained. Some of the oldest skimming from the early years of the ledger might fall outside the window the law allowed for charges. There are time limits on these things, and a clever defense lawyer would push hard on the older entries. But the pattern was ongoing, and the most serious conduct, The forged withdrawals from Walter's personal accounts was recent enough and severe enough to be very much alive. The estate has standing, she said. As the inheritor of the Sycamore property and a beneficiary, you can pursue civil recovery. And a forensic report this clean, paired with the forged signature evidence, is exactly the kind of thing a county prosecutor takes seriously when it comes to financial abuse of an elder. She was careful, like Paula, never promising an outcome. She talked about referrals, about how the prosecutor's office would make its own decision, about how restitution worked, about the difference between what the documents proved and what a court would ultimately do. I appreciated it. After weeks of my family's confident lies, there was something steadying about a professional who refused to overpromise. I asked the only question that mattered to me. Is it enough to make sure this doesn't just get buried? Grace looked at the stack of Walter's work between us. Honey, she said, your grandfather spent 9 years making sure it couldn't be buried. Our job is just to carry it the last mile. I signed the engagement papers, and we started the slow machinery that my father, for all his noise, would never be able to shout down. People think revenge is loud. It isn't. It's a forensic accountant, a stack of bank statements, and a calendar of court dates. If you want to see exactly how the room that laughed went silent, stay with me. And hit subscribe. The quiet ones are about to win. Brenda found me in the grocery store parking lot a few days later. She must have been waiting. She came out from between the cars too fast to be a coincidence, and the polished version of her was gone. No bright voice, no hearts in a text. Her hands were shaking. Please, she said. Eli, please. Whatever you found, please. I stood by my cart and let her talk, because something in her face told me this was the one true thing she'd say to me in years. It came out in pieces. She knew about the money. Not the details, not the worst of it, but enough. Curtis had brought her papers to sign over the years and told her not to read them, and she hadn't, because reading them would have meant knowing. They were drowning, she said. The lifestyle everyone envied was held together with debt and other people's money, and she'd spent so long pretending it was fine that she'd forgotten there was another way to live. I have kids, she said. If this comes out, what happens to my kids? For a moment I felt it, the pull she was aiming for. She was a human being, frightened, standing in a parking lot asking me to make her fear go away. I didn't doubt that her panic was real, but I also thought about Walter's forged signature, made by a hand in that family while he lay in a bed I'd helped change. I'm sorry you got pulled into this, I told her, and I meant it. I really am. But I'm not going to bury it. He didn't, and he had more reason than anyone. She started to cry. I left my cart, walked her gently back toward her car, and drove home with my hands steady on the wheel. Sympathy is not the same as surrender. My father switched tactics when the shame campaign didn't break me. He came to my apartment, alone this time, and for the first time in my adult life, he tried to sound like a father. He sat at my kitchen table, in the chair across from my wall of index cards, which I hadn't bothered to hide, and he didn't look at them. Your mother would be heartbroken, he said. God rest her, watching you tear this family apart over an old man's grudges. I let him talk. He invoked everything. My dead mother. Sunday dinners we'd stopped having years ago. The idea of family like it was a debt I'd failed to pay. Walter was bitter at the end, he said. He poisoned you against us. You think those papers mean something, but all you've got is a sick old man's resentment. Then he reached for the line he'd used in the lawyer's office, the one that started all of this, and he said it softer this time, almost kind. He left you a pile of junk, sweetheart. Don't let it ruin your whole life. And there it was, the same sentence, turned inside out. In that office it had been an insult thrown to make a room laugh. Now it was a plea, because the pile of junk had become the most dangerous thing in his world. I looked at my father, at the fear underneath the performance, and I felt almost calm. You keep calling it junk, I said. But you drove all the way over here to talk me out of it. People don't beg about junk. His jaw tightened. He stood, knocked the chair back into place too hard, and left without another word. I sat alone with my grandfather's record and understood that the begging meant I'd already won the only argument that mattered. A week later, the invitation came, dressed up as a family meeting. My father called, formal and stiff, and said the family wanted to sit down together and resolve the estate like adults. There would be a lawyer present, he said. His lawyer. They wanted me to come to Pruitt's office, the same long table, and work out a fair arrangement for the Sycamore house. I knew exactly what the meeting was. It was the will reading again, staged a second time with the same audience, except this time they meant to corner me into signing the house away before the slow legal machinery could finish turning. They wanted the property sold and gutted, the workshop emptied, the drawers hauled to a landfill, the record gone, all of it framed as me finally being reasonable. I said yes. Grace, my attorney, raised an eyebrow when I told her. You don't have to attend, she said. We can do all of this through filings. I knew that, but I thought about Walter, who could have done all of this quietly through filings too, and who instead made sure the proof would land in the exact room where the laughing happened. There's a difference between justice and a reckoning. Justice can be done on paper, in an office, between professionals. A reckoning has to be witnessed. The people who laughed needed to be in the room when the laughter stopped. I'll go, I told Grace. I want them all there. I want the same table. She studied me for a second, then nodded slowly, the way Henry had, the way Paula had. All right, she said. Then we go in prepared. You don't say much. You let the documents do the talking. I almost smiled. That, I said, is the only thing my grandfather ever taught me. The night before the meeting, I laid everything out on my table one last time and built it into a single ordered packet, the way Walter built his case in that bank drawer. The forensic report on top, Paula's findings in plain language. Then the parallel ledgers, the official lie beside Walter's truth. Then the forged checks, paired with his real signature for any eye to compare. Then the letter. Last, in its own sleeve. Because some things you save for the end. I confirmed by email that the prosecutor's office had received Grace's referral packet and logged it. Not a promise of charges, but a fact on the record that could not be uncalled. Henry phoned to say he'd be there in the morning, in a suit, ready to confirm everything he knew about how Walter had assembled the evidence and why. I sat with the worn $10 bill, the cedar and oil smell of the workshop still living in my coat. The green ledger's cracked spine under my hand. 3 small things they'd thought were worthless. A tear-down house, a pocket full of change, a grandfather they'd written off as a broke old man. I wasn't angry anymore. Anger is loud and it burns out. And I'd need to be steady, not hot, for what was coming. I was something better than angry. I was ready. I thought about all the Sundays I'd shown up, all the pillboxes and the cardiology appointments and the porch conversations, and I understood now that I hadn't been wasting my time on a broke old man at all. I'd been earning the only inheritance that ever mattered, his trust and his lesson. The careful ones win the case. In the morning, I would walk back into the room that laughed at me, and I would not raise my voice once. It was the same room, the same long table, the same window Curtis liked to sit beside, the same chair my father took at the head like a throne. Brenda was there, pale, not looking at me. The cousins came too, curious, sensing theater. My father's lawyer was a brisk man with a thin folder, and Pruitt sat off to one side, uneasy, like a man who'd realized too late which side of a thing he was on. I came in with Grace and Henry, and I took the same seat I'd taken at the will reading, by the door. My father smiled when he saw it, mistaking it for smallness. He let his lawyer open. The man slid a single sheet across the table toward me, a quitclaim deed already drawn up. The Sycamore property signed over to a holding company, a modest check clipped to the corner. We think this is more than fair, my father said warmly, performing for the cousins. Eli's not a property person. We take the headache, She gets a clean start. Everybody wins. He spread his hands. Let's just put Grandpa's mess behind us and be a family again. The room waited for me to crumble or to argue. I did neither. I didn't reach for the deed. I reached into my bag and took out the packet, and I set it on the table without hurry, squaring its edges the way I square a returned book before it goes back on the shelf. My father's smile stayed, but his eyes dropped to the stack, and I watched the first flicker of doubt cross his face. Curtis went very still by the window. Grace folded her hands. I looked at my father, at the deed sitting between us, and I finally spoke, in the calmest voice I owned. Before I sign anything, I said, I think everyone should see what's actually in the junk. I opened the packet and laid it out, one document at a time, narrating each in the same level tone I used to explain the fax machine to confused patrons. This is the store's official ledger, I said, sliding the first page to the center. And this is the one my grandfather kept at the same time, in his own hand, for 9 years. I set them side by side. They don't match. Money left the business through inflated vendor payments, and a share of it came back out to accounts that weren't the store's. The initials in the margin are CM and RM. I didn't look up at my uncle or my father when I said their initials. I let the paper do it. Then I laid down the forensic report. A licensed forensic accountant reviewed all of it. She quantified the loss. It's substantial, and it's documented. Brenda made a small sound. My father started to speak, and I kept going, gently, the way you keep reading over an interruption. And these, I said, placing the forged checks beside Walter's genuine signature, are withdrawals from my grandfather's personal accounts in the last 2 years of his life, signed with his name by someone whose hand was not his. He could barely hold a pen by then. I changed his bedsheets. I know exactly how sick he was when these were signed. The room had gone completely silent, the kind of silence that has weight. My father's lawyer was reading the forensic report upside down and going gray. Curtis had not moved, but the color was leaving his face in real time. I placed the last item on the table, the letter, still in its sleeve, and rested 2 fingers on it. I looked at my father, who had laughed in this room and called my inheritance a pile of junk, and I said the only thing I'd planned to say. It wasn't junk. My voice didn't rise. It was the receipt for everything you took. Nobody laughed this time. Nobody made a sound at all. Then my father exploded, exactly the way I knew he would. He shoved back from the table and the chair toppled. "This is garbage," he shouted. "A senile old man's garbage, and she's been forging this whole story." He was pointing at me, his face red, his voice cracking against the walls. His own lawyer put a hand on his arm and said his name low and sharp, the way you say a name to stop someone from convicting himself in front of witnesses. Curtis, who never raised his voice, finally spoke, and his calm was worse than the shouting. "Where did you get the bank records?" he said quietly, not denying, asking. The careful question of a man calculating how much was already lost. Grace answered for me, smooth and unbothered. "They were lawfully inherited, and a referral is already with the county prosecutor's office. It's logged. I'd suggest everyone speak to their own attorneys before saying anything further." That word, prosecutor, landed in the room like a dropped weight. The cousins were staring at their fathers now, the theater they'd come for turning into something they hadn't wanted to see. Brenda was crying without sound. And my father, my loud, confident father, who had stood in my library and called me a manipulator in front of toddlers, sat back down slowly, like his legs had stopped trusting him. The red drained out of his face and left something I had never once seen there. Fear. Plain, animal fear. The look of a man who has just understood that the thing he laughed at has been quietly assembling itself into his undoing for 9 years, and that the careful daughter he dismissed was the one holding it. He didn't shout again. He couldn't. He just stared at the worn $10 bill, which I'd set on top of the letter, and he started to come apart in front of everyone he'd performed for. The room that exploded with laughter sat in total silence. I gathered my documents back into their order, slid the original packet to Grace, and left the quitclaim deed lying untouched on the table where my father had pushed it. "I won't be signing this," I said. "The house isn't for sale, and the workshop stays exactly where it is." Nobody tried to stop me. The cousins wouldn't meet my eyes. My father's lawyer was already murmuring about separate counsel and saying very little out loud. Curtis watched me go with the flat, assessing stare of a man rearranging his whole future. And I understood that the stillness in him was not strength. It was a man doing math he was going to lose. I stood, picked up the worn bill last, and put it back in my coat pocket where it had ridden for weeks. Then I walked to the door of the same room I'd walked out of the day the will was read. The first time, I'd left to the sound of laughter, smiling so they wouldn't see anything at all. This time I left to silence, and the smile, when it came, was for myself. At the will reading they thought they were watching me lose. They were actually watching my grandfather win. Slowly, from a chair none of them could see, through the one grandchild who'd learned to count carefully. I pushed open the door and stepped out into the hall, and behind me I could hear my father's voice, smaller now, asking his lawyer the same question over and over. "What do we do? What do we do?" I didn't have an answer for him. Walter had spent 9 years making sure that by the time he asked it, it would already be too late. The reckoning came the way Walter built it to come. Slowly, on paper, impossible to shout down. The county prosecutor's office opened a review. It was not fast. These cases never are. But Walter had handed them a nearly finished investigation, and that spared them the years of reconstruction that usually bury elder fraud files before they ever reach a courtroom. Most of a year passed in filings and interviews before Curtis was charged under Ohio law for the financial abuse and the forged withdrawals. The older skimming was messier. Some of it passed the limits the law allowed, but the recent conduct was clean and serious, and it was enough. My father faced charges of his own and a civil action from the estate seeking restitution, and a court would spend the next long while deciding the exact size of what he owed. Mercer Hardware went into receivership and was eventually sold, the proceeds routed toward repaying what had been taken. Brenda cooperated early, which I was told helped her. I hoped, for her kids' sake, that it did. I didn't celebrate any of it. There's no champagne in watching your family's name become a cautionary tale at the diner. But I didn't look away either. I kept the Sycamore house. I fixed the porch and the gutters myself. Badly at first, then better. I cleaned the workshop and left the wall of numbered drawers exactly as he'd built it. And I took the part of the recovered money that came to the estate and did the thing his letter had hoped for without ever quite asking. I started a fund at my library, in his name, the Walter Mercer Fund, to teach reading and basic financial literacy to anyone in town who'd been told they weren't smart enough to understand their own money. The first class filled in a week. I taught it myself, on Sunday afternoons, in the hours I used to spend driving an old man to his appointments. It felt like keeping a promise I hadn't known I'd made. My grandfather spent his whole life proving that the cheapest-looking thing in the room is often the one holding everything together. And that integrity is the only ledger that always balances, no matter how loudly someone insists the numbers say otherwise. That's my story. A rundown house, a $10 bill, and a grandfather who trusted me to look closely when no one else would. If someone in your family has ever been underestimated for being the quiet, careful one, send them this video. They'll understand it. And if you believe the truth keeps better records than the loudest voice in the room, subscribe, leave a comment, and I'll see you in the next one.